I was moving my car in New York City. You got to do that when the street sweepers come if you want to avoid paying for parking, which is prohibitive in New York and its environs, I should say. And I got into the car. I listened to Sean Hannity. Sean Hannity starts the show off by saying, and of course, the big news from this weekend is the release of a letter by Lisa Graves. And of course, I thought, as soon as I heard the public release of a letter, I thought it was going to be dealing with the Kavanaugh nomination. But instead, it was with Donald Trump basically releasing a tremendous amount of information about the early stages. I guess there's a reason why he can't access and doesn't want to release the later stages of the Russia investigation. But you write in the Nation magazine that this and other things constitute Donald Trump actively obstructing justice. Break it down for us.
It's not very complicated. And here's the bottom line. We're all for transparency. I mean, I probably am more for transparency than anybody you're going to meet. I'm pretty willing to release an awful lot of stuff. But when a president of the United States, under the veil of transparency, saying he just wants to be open about stuff, targets specific information related to ongoing investigations into people associated with his campaign and his presidency, an investigation that an awful lot of people believe will ultimately end up at his doorstep. When he does so with the clear purpose of undermining that investigation, when he in fact acknowledges that this is a case where the president of the United States, the current president of the United States, is committing acts that the House Judiciary Committee in 1974, specifically in their most broadly backed article of impeachment against Richard Nixon, said was not only an impeachable act, but an act for which a president should be tried and, on the vote of the Senate, removed from office. So, I mean, you have achieved the standard by any reasonable measure. And I might add that back in 1974, that article of impeachment was the one that more Republicans backed. I mean, that a substantial number of Republicans, not all of them, on the committee said, well, yeah, this is baseline stuff. If the president is telling the Department of Justice what to do and meddling in their investigations, which is precisely what Donald Trump has done, that's impeachable. And so, I don't think we should, we have to parse it much beyond that. And remember that this is the president of the United States literally naming the names of the investigators, all of whom are in incredibly important positions as regards these inquiries, naming the names of the people who he wants to not just be exposed, but whose notes, whose emails, whose communications about a very delicate investigation he wants brought out into the public. Why does he want that? Except to benefit himself politically. And I know it seems naive, almost innocent, but presidents of the United States do not get to make orders as regards law enforcement, as regards the rule of law in this country, merely for their political advantage.
What, in the context of Watergate, what did Nixon's attempt to, or not even attempt, I guess, his firing of Archibald Cox and the what is known as the Saturday Night Massacre, I guess,
right?
Which was a similar circumstance, right, where they were basically looking for, I think, officials at the Justice Department to end, these inquiries. What did that end up being part of the impeachment as well?
Sure. This is stuff that was actively discussed by the committee, as led by Peter Rodino, and discussed by Democrats and Republicans people who were Nixon fans, and frankly, some people who were willing to defend the president on a lot of the issues that arose. But one of the deepest concerns was that Richard Nixon didn't fire Archibald Cox, right? He fired people trying to get to Archibald Cox. He meddled with the upper levels of the Department of Justice till he got somebody in place who would do his bidding.
I see. Okay.
And that's think about where we're at right now. You're the president of the United States, angry as heck at Jeff Sessions because Jeff Sessions has recused himself from the Russia inquiry, saying pretty visceral stuff about all sorts of people at the Department of Justice. And you ask yourself, why is he so angry? Why is he so impassioned, right? Well, might it have something to do with the investigation, which he repeatedly refers to as a witch hunt and attacks, kind of at every turn, led by Robert Mueller, who the president is not in a position to fire, but that upper level people at the Department of Justice potentially could.
Right.
I mean, so the parallels here are great, and they're not things that we should underestimate. And we also should not underestimate this manipulation of information, this effort to manipulate information. The fact of the matter is that one of the great lines out of Watergate was that we don't, you don't necessarily always get people for the crime, you get them for the cover-up. Well, the cover-up is the manipulation of information. It is the efforts to mangle, warp, alter what we know and when we know it and how we know it, with the purpose of benefiting, in this case, a president of the United States who has a great deal of power. And I would suggest that the abuses of power by Richard Nixon and the abuses of power by Donald Trump are not exactly the same, but are sufficiently parallel that this is a moment at which to pause and recognize, as has been suggested, not just by me, but by constitutional lawyers, constitutional law professors, by savvy observers of what's going on. This is classic impeachable stuff.
All right. Well, I want to take a break in a moment. When we come back, I want to talk about more about Jeff Sessions in this context, because, I mean, on one hand, the guy is getting a certain amount of credit for standing strong, I guess, and not and not firing, or I should say, because he recused himself and not, I guess, presumably recusing himself or unrecusing himself. I'm not exactly sure what the expectation is, or for not resigning. But meanwhile, of course, he's expending a lot of energy, essentially terrorizing immigrants in this country as what appears to be some type of quid pro quo, maybe with Stephen Miller in the White House. I mean, who knows? We'll talk about that for a moment. But what I'm really interested in getting at is that now that we've established, or that we have established a historical establishment of about as analogous of a situation as you can get when we look at least the charges of obstruction in the context of why Nixon was impeached. The question then becomes, does it matter? Does it matter? Because this is a completely political process. And are those people who are trying to avoid impeachment playing that political game better than the people who might ultimately be seeking to impeach the president? We got to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll return with John Nichols from The Nation magazine. Okay, we got another 8 minutes in this one. So, John, when we broke, you had basically broken down for us the broad contours of some of the impeachment, I guess indictments, really, in some respects, of Richard Nixon that made it into the articles of impeachment regarding his obstruction of justice. He and certainly we have yet to see it in the case of Jeff Sessions, but As you know, Nixon fired those people who had appointed Archibald Cox, looking for Cox to be fired. I think it was Richardson who decided to leave. I think he had to go.
Richardson said no, then Ruckelshaus said no, and then I think, if I'm right here, they got to Bork.
Right, and Bork was the one who ended up firing Cox in what ultimately became known as the Saturday Night Massacre. Those moves never made it into the articles of impeachment, but they were discussed. And of course, there was no impeachment of Nixon. They were just contemplating them.
Right.
But certainly what Trump has done, and you made the case that what Trump has done up to this point has been blatant obstruction of justice. Now, it looks like Mueller is going for a fuller Monty, if you will. But just based upon that, we could see articles of impeachment. But with that said, and people seem to forget this because they ask, where are the Howard Bakers and the Republicans of yesteryear? Well, those Republicans weren't in control of the Senate, A, and B, it's a very different Republican Party than it was 40 years ago. And C, it seems like Donald Trump has, at the very least, his advisors have internalized the fact that impeachment is a political process, and they have done everything they could at this point, including creating these fictions around different FBI agents and whatnot to muddy those waters. They are preparing for a political campaign, it seems to me. And on the other side, you don't see one.
That's right. And I think you said a lot there that is precisely correct. Let me add one other thing. You said the Republican Party is not the same Republican Party it was in 1973, 1974. The Democratic Party is also not the same party that it was. And one of the painful realities about impeachment, a subject I wrote a book on, and have written a lot about over the years, is that the understanding of impeachment was very badly warped by the attempt of Brett Kavanaugh and some of his associates to impeach Bill Clinton, or at least to investigate Bill Clinton in an inquiry that led to an attempted impeachment.
Well, they did impeach him, right? They just didn't convict him in the Senate.
Right. Yes, exactly. And what happened there is that they went after Clinton initially on a host of mid-level claims. They ended up down with some claims as regards sex that were frankly ridiculed by the vast majority of people, and as such, they diminished the impeachment process there. Also, though, they created an imagination that all impeachments are going to be unpopular, that if you do this, it's a third rail, it's a dangerous thing, and you may lose politically. Well, here's where the problem comes in. History doesn't tell us that. What history tells us is that, if you manipulate up an impeachment that the people do not see as legitimate, that could hurt you a little bit politically. I'll just remind you that Republicans did retain control of the Congress, and ultimately, they struggled to the Senate back and forth, but they didn't exactly lose everything as a result of the 1998 impeachment. But if you go back to 1974 and you look at that, an impeachment that was not fully realized, Nixon resigned, and yet, if you look at that, you say, well, the Democrats must have been punished for creating that constitutional crisis. No, they had a landslide victory that brought in one of the most impassioned reform Congresses in American history, and then 2 years later, they got the presidency of the United States. And so, one of the counsels that I give is that you can't just think about this in political terms. Sometimes you do have to think about, what is the right thing to do? How do you, at what point do you have to step up? And that's hard. It's hard to get beyond politics. And it's harder today because both the Democratic and the Republican Party play what authors have referred to as winner-take-all politics. They're so, kind of in the thick of this, strategizing on everything, that they don't always rise to, the constitutional moment. And so we, at this point, are having a very stilted discussion about impeachment. I write about it quite a bit. Other very much wiser people than I write about it and talk about it. Some members of Congress bring it up, but we have to be realistic here and say that you have a barrier, obviously, with Paul Ryan and his Republican allies in the House, where impeachment originates, putting every barrier in front of it, of course. But then you also have a lot of Democrats who are incredibly cautious about this because they're afraid it will somehow, as you suggest, benefit Trump, that Trump will build up a political head of steam off this. And at some point, my counsel is that you have to put the calculations aside, that you have to recognize that you have an active obstruction of justice occurring. And it ought to be called out as such, and it ought to be noted and stated that when a president is engaged actively in the obstruction of justice, there was a counter to that was created. And that counter was created in 1787 when George Mason and other members of that body that created our Constitution. In that summer of 1787, George Mason said that no power is of more importance that it be maintained than the power of impeachment, because it answers the question, shall any man be above the law? I'm paraphrasing here. And particularly, shall the man who makes the laws or who enforces the laws be above the law? And this is a critical discussion that we, the people, ought to be having.
John Nichols, couldn't agree with you more. And it's something I think that I think we have yet to see peak obstruction. I think we probably are going to see more of this on the other side of November's election. But appreciate your breaking this down for us. Always fascinating to talk to you. John Nichols at The Nation Magazine, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.